was said earlier, I want to say good morning to you all, too. It's great to see you. Now to Scripture. How do we understand the relationship between divine grace and our own capacity to reflect grace in the lives and relationships we share with others in the world? The familiar words of the parable of the lost sheep suggest that our capacity to approach God's expressions of grace, mercy, and forgiveness involves first our willingness to set aside conventional notions of justice in favor of a deeper commitment to reconciliation and communion. We invite you to attend to a word revealing the grace of God from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 15, verses 1 through 7. Now all the tax collectors and sinners were approaching him to listen, and the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling their disapproval, saying, "This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them." So he told them this parable. Which one of you, having 100 sheep and losing one of them, does not leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after the one that is lost until he finds it? When he has found it, he lays it on his shoulders and rejoices. And when he comes home, he calls together his friends and neighbors, saying to them, "Rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep that was lost." Just so, I tell you, there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous people who need no repentance. This is the word of God for us, the people of God. Thanks be to God.
So I am both cautious and conscious of what amount of truth we can all stand to bear this morning. It is a delicate time, filled with conflicting information, growing anxiety, a shortage of toilet paper, general uncertainty about what is coming next. And that is just the things that involve the coronavirus. This is to say nothing of everything else that may be going on in our lives. Private griefs, anxiety over our work. So I am cautious about the need to be delicate. But the reality is that we are in the midst of an epidemic, one the like of which very few of us have seen. We have come to recognize, perhaps slowly, and acknowledge with hesitation the scale of this challenge, which is often our habit in the Western world, inoculated as we often are from the grimmer and grimier realities that so much of the world outside of us faces on a daily basis. But the numbers are out there and they're difficult to ignore. The global number of infected with COVID-19 is fast approaching 120,000. There is good news, of course. 65,000 people who have been infected with the virus have already recovered. But hold that against the grief of 4,000 deaths, and the smaller number seems to take precedent. Our slowness to acknowledge and recognize the scope of this is not helped by the absence of a truly coherent national or global response, in part due to confused messages from our leadership, in part because for all the money spent on healthcare in America, we really have nothing like a national healthcare apparatus that is capable of addressing and treating what has become, and no doubt will continue to be, a pandemic concern. That is a difficult and challenging reality that we all face. The question is, what comes next? What emerges in the aftermath of COVID-19, of what seems to be shaping up as our first great shared experience as a global community in at least a generation, but perhaps more than that as well? Our first experience hasn't been a good one, but they never are, really. All that is good is what happens afterwards. What confronting this together brings forward, allows to emerge in the aftermath. There is, of course, the often mentioned hoarding of toilet paper, which is at both times slightly comic, but also predictable, as a response to circumstances that seem to be rapidly spiraling outside of our personal control. And it is a universal truth, I suspect, that nothing moves sensible caution to fear, to panic faster than the sense that our own capacities to manage a situation simply are no longer sufficient or have been completely exhausted. I can't help think of that young man who emptied several stores in his neighborhood of their supplies of hand sanitizer, nearly 18,000 containers, only to find that Amazon would not allow him to sell them on their site. Again, it is as predictable as the coming of an unwelcome season, this compulsion we seem to have to capitalize, quite literally capitalize, on a crisis. To wring profit out of calamity by looking after ourselves first, with the presumption that someone else will take care of everyone else. It is a sensibility that has left us with the greatest healthcare facilities in the world, but without anything that might function as a public healthcare system. One that works to anticipate crises like this, provide resources, guidance, and care for the millions that will no doubt be affected. So now we are face to face with this epidemic. And not as a personal or private experience, but as a global one. One that puts all of us in communion and fellowship with all of us. And so it must be a challenge that we face together. It cannot be remedied in the short term by looking out for ourselves alone. We are where we are because of long-term neglect. Not simply of the healthcare system or anything else, but of any real sense of a common good, of a national and global sensibility that public good is not the sum of individual needs and desires, but arises only out of a robust practice of what is good for all of us together. The Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann is famous among his readership for saying that God's best work is done in the wilderness, in a time of crisis, in those times when we feel tempted to give in to despair, when desolation seems the overwhelming sentiment. Brueggemann writes that the greatest crisis facing any human community at any time is one that concerns our commitment to this idea, this notion of a common good, to this sense of solidarity that binds us to a clear understanding that we share a common destiny, both the rich and the poor, the welcome and the unwelcome, the have and the have-nots. We acknowledge as well that what we face now is not simply an epidemiological crisis with respect to COVID-19 alone, but a spiritual crisis as well. It is, I suspect, a crisis born out of our passive acceptance of all of those nameless but powerful forces in our world that resist any attempt to forge a collective understanding and practice of a common good, of a shared destiny. All those forces that atomize us, that divide us into individual units ruled by personal need and desire. We have resisted coming to terms with the power of private interest, of sectarian division, of social and economic inequality for too long. We have for too long made a god of profit, and the consequence of that has come home to roost. So what indeed comes next? What emerges in the aftermath of this crisis? What is going to inspire our imaginations? What will make us creative in our thinking about how a new world will emerge in the aftermath of all of this? What will this current crisis do to foster something in us of a more robust sense of a global life and a global community? It's hard to say, of course. But in the midst of a crisis as disorienting and confusing as this one, it is important, perhaps even essential, for us to consider our spiritual well-being as well as our physical one. To look for those candles in the window, those lights around us and within us that speak to the assurance that whatever happens now does not obscure that something new will come. Jesus spent a good deal of his time reflecting for and with his various audiences on the very question of what confronts us today, of what comes next. He knew, looking around at his world, that it could not continue to operate as it was. It could not operate for long, ruled by a system of shame, of status, of competing authorities, of atomized interests. It was slowly breaking apart. And something was coming. Something in his mind, in his body, incarnate throughout his entire life. Something new coming out of the heart of God. And so he spoke in these parables, some of which spoke of the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven. This new thing that was emerging. This new thing that imagined a world in which God's rule of compassion would affect a radical transformation of practice and policy and values, that the privileges and well-being too often afforded to the wealthy alone would gather in the poor and the sick as well, would make a place at the table for those outcast and cast aside, would usher in a new age of solidarity, the very commitment to the common good we so desperately need in our own time. And while the parable of the lost sheep is not a kingdom parable as such, it does offer a particular word of hope for what God's new thing might look like. As Sarah invited us to do a moment ago, I would consider for a moment, again, that sheep lost in the wilderness. Alone, adrift, terrified, without company or shelter, facing an uncertain future with dread. There it is. Alone, adrift, terrified, without company or shelter, facing the future with dread. So imagine also those people among us, around us, scattered throughout the world, now facing this crisis, alone, in their own respective wildernesses. Those with compromised health, unable to afford treatment, those without shelter, living under bridges or encamped with other homeless people, subject to the ravages of this virus, without ready and evident support. Imagine everyone throughout the world knowing themselves to be vulnerable and alone. Now imagine also that extraordinary sense of relief that single sheep must have felt when she is suddenly lifted up on the shoulders of the shepherd and carried home with joy. Imagine as well the joys of those fearful among us of being neglected in the midst of our current challenge, dreading the onset of a cough, knowing that there is little recourse for them. Imagine their joy at also being lifted up. Imagine their joy at being carried on the shoulders of a community that seeks only to assure their health and wellness and well-being as well. We have heard a lot over the past few days about hope. We have to be hopeful. But hope is not simply a word that we say. It cannot simply be a word that we say. It also must be an articulation, a manifestation of our faith in the idea that something new is always coming out of God, a new expression of God's resolve for our goodness and flourishing that awaits only our shared commitment to rise to meet it. There are an unimaginable number and variety of sheep wandering lost in the wilderness in this time. Those sickened by the virus, desperate for medicine. Those who will no doubt carry the unfortunate and tragic stigma of blame. They will need strong, urgent voices to protect them. Those who are told to stay at home, alone. They will need loving and compassionate people to stand with them. Because the reality is that, to quote Martin Luther King, we may have come here on separate boats, but we are in the same ship together now. And whatever will come, brothers and sisters, in the next few weeks and months, the only thing that will guide us to something better, to rise, to meet God's promise of resurrection, is if we commit ourselves to the understanding that we are in this together for the long term. We are often inclined to see this parable of the lost sheep as primarily a source, as the sheep in this parable, rather, as the primary source of need in this story. And really it is. But it's not the only source of need. The one who wanders off and is saved tends to dominate our understanding, but there is something more. Jesus' audience would have understood in hearing this parable that there were sort of code words in it. They would have also understood that the herd was diminished by the sheep that wandered off. They would have seen that, or heard rather, that 99 sheep were left as the shepherd went after the one that was lost. And they would have known that 99 was not a good number. It was a number that symbolized a sense of fracture and division, a sense of emptiness and incompletion. So to bring back the lost sheep saves the sheep, but it makes the fold whole again, complete and restored as the community of God. So it's not altogether different for us in this time. It is our work to determine who is lost among us, and to the extent that we have the capacity to do so, to bring them home. Because bringing them home will not only save them, it will save us. It will make our communities, our nation, our world complete as well. And it will affirm for us that our deepest hopes are only realized when we acknowledge that we are in this and everything together. That is where our future lies. That is what will bind up what is broken and divided among us and will draw us closer dear friends, to God's resolve for what is good, that for what is good for us must be good for all of us together. Thanks be to God. Amen.